Hear the Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Matthew. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men came from the east to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born, King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising, and we have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. Calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, and so it has been written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel.'" Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. They knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. This is the gospel of the Lord. So please be seated. I was thinking, what makes kind of countries famous? Does anyone remember years ago there's a film once made called Wales Land of Song? And it was a kind of highly stereotyped view of the valleys, and a man called Clifford Lloyd coming back to some valley chapel place to become the director of music, and everyone running around excitedly and singing in their kitchens, all this kind of thing. It was, I don't think it's one of the great moments in cinematography, but once it was a kind of view of Wales that people sang all the time. And there's a certain element of truth, but I know last time I watched Rugby International in the pub, no one was singing, which is a bit disappointing to my mind. But there was that sense that once there was a kind of light shining out from Wales about singing. And apparently in Lithuania, half the population were members of choirs or something. And so once a year they have this big choral festival, and then half the population turn out to watch the other half singing in choirs. So I've heard. But there's a kind of reputation about that. If you said about New Zealand, what is the reputation of New Zealand? What's it known for? I'd suggest there's the All Blacks and the Lord of the Rings, because famously it was used as the set for the filming of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit films. So now people go there to go and view the sets and sort of try and relive some of the experience of watching the movies. And of course the All Blacks are an amazing rugby team that are practically unbeatable. So basically whenever they're playing someone, I want the other side to win. The forlorn hope that one day the All Blacks will lose. But there's a kind of radiance from New Zealand, which is the All Blacks, which is a bit of an oxymoron really, because they wear black, don't they? But I was thinking that the reading from Isaiah, when it says, "Arise, shine, your light has come," is speaking to the whole nation of Israel. When it says arise and shine, it's saying something about you now is going to shine over the world. You'll become known. Your reputation will become something. Then your light has come. Something is going to arrive there which is going to make them, if you like, famous. And then it says the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. So this thing which is going to make them famous is the glory of the Lord. And then in contrast, it talks about darkness covering the earth and thick darkness the peoples. So in other words, in some way, everyone else will be in some kind of darkness, either ignorance or folly or whatever, wickedness. Probably basically just ignorance, actually. And then it says, but the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. And the idea of the rising, the light, the shining, all this kind of thing, obviously is evocative of the dawn, obviously it's not actually talking about the dawn as such, but it's using that kind of idea. And then it says that the nations will come to your light. So it's as if this thing which will happen will draw people to them. Kings to the brightness of your dawn. And then we get the famous thing at the end, and they'll bring gold and frankincense. And that little line at the end there is often taken as somehow fulfilled in the Magi as they came to bring gold and frankincense, but also myrrh, to Jesus when he was laid when he was a tiny little child. Because notice he's not in his manger there. It says, and they came and saw the child. And then when Herod asks them and then kills all the children, he says, under 2 years old, according to the time they had said. So in other words, when the Magi got to Herod, they told him when they'd seen the star at its rising, note the word rising, and then he kills all the children of approximately that age. So I guess, because they're not counting in exactly the same way, they mean every child over a year old, or under 2 years old. So when they actually got to Jesus, he was about a year old, or maybe 18 months or something like that. Possibly 2, not necessarily 2. But you're talking about a toddler by now, not necessarily a tiny little babe in arms. And and I suppose if you looked at the map at the time of Isaiah was writing about the year 780 BC. And if you looked at the map then, there are various nations around them, of whom Judah would have been just one. There's Judah, and then there was Samaria to the north, also called Israel. And there was the king of Aram, and there was the king of Moab, there's the king of Edom. There's also the Assyrians over to the the northeast. There's also the Elamites and the Medians over to the far east. There's also, there's countless little nations and city-states and all kinds of things around there. And if you sort of went through the map and asked how many of those places still existed in the popular imagination, I think practically none of them are still there, except one. And that is Judah. Because the word Jew comes from Judah. In other words, 2,780 odd years later, we're still talking about Judah, and all the other nations, which at the time would be simply seen as other nations, have gone and vanished. And we're still talking about Judah or Israel. You know, we're still reading these things about that history. Even though this was a long time ago, and every other country from them basically vanished. Iraq wasn't even a twinkle in the eye then. Syria, and sometimes the word Syria comes up in the Old Testament. Basically, they're translating another word like Aram or Assyria or something like that. You know, it's to make it more intelligible. All those other places have vanished. Their reputation is gone. And yet this one still exists. It persists. Now, when you see the map now, it still says Israel on it. That's got, apart from Egypt, that's about the only country which is still running from that time. You ever thought about that? No other country has actually, well, Egypt, again, has eventually been going longer. I can't think of any other country which has actually existed for as long as that. And so when it says, all the peoples will come to your light, you know, the fact we're still talking about it is proof of that. We're still coming to that light. We're still talking about that country, as Isaiah prophesied. But what he's actually talking about, the thing which he's referring to, I think is fulfilled in Matthew, where it says how he was born and how these men, these magi, it says they came from the east. There's a kind of little bit of a pun possibly going on here, because the word in Greek for east and rising is the same word. So when it says they've come from the rising to Jerusalem, whereas the star we saw at its rising, or they've come from the east, whereas the star we saw at its east, or something like that, There's a little bit of a pun happening there, which obviously resonates with Isaiah, when they're talking about the rising of the light, the rising of the sun, the rising of their dawn, and all this kind of thing. And yet here they talk about this star that is rising. What did they actually see? I have no idea. I've heard various theories about conjunctions and meteorites and asteroids and all kinds of things. I haven't got the faintest idea. And in a way, it's kind of missing the point. The point is they saw something which moved them to search him out. Now it says quite clearly they came from the east. They're obviously foreigners. They're from somewhere else. They're not from locally. The Roman Empire basically stopped in now what we'd call Iraq, about the Euphrates. And there the Parthian Empire began. The Parthian Empire was the inheritor of the Persian Empire. And it was huge. It was massive. It went on forever in the other direction. And the Magi were, if you like, the scholarly, priestly caste from the Parthian Empire. They were everywhere. They were like the religious civil service, as one person put it. And so they were almost like a kind of embassy from this other empire, the other side of the world. And maybe that's why Herod actually received them, because if they were just a bunch of travelling charlatans or fortune tellers, he wouldn't bother giving them any house room. But if they were a kind of embassy from the Parthian Empire, then, well, yes, of course he would have to acknowledge them. He didn't want to enrage the emperor of Parthia. And so when they start talking about this boy who was born as king, suddenly he's thinking, but I'm king, aren't I? Who's this child who's born as king? Why is this foreign ruler telling me there's been born a king in my land? So then the kind of the sense of fear and the reason that he might have received them and taken them seriously becomes a little bit more obvious if they've just come with this big entourage from this far-off exotic empire in the east. And notice it says how he's born a king. It's not one who might become a king or one who will aspire to be king. He's actually born a king. I mean, he doesn't actually have to do anything to become king, according to them. And yet, no one noticed. Some people have pointed out that the fact they want to do him homage, in the ancient times, this was seen as deeply significant. Because they already had a king of their own to whom they'd do homage. And they already had gods, deities of their own, to whom they'd do homage. So why would they come all this way to do homage to this foreigner? It's almost as if they were acknowledged this one to be somehow superior over their own. That somehow this one would be greater than their own king. That somehow the spiritual significance of this divine child would be somehow greater than the significance of their own gods. That somehow they were relinquishing their loyalties. This isn't something I've heard much recently, but apparently in ancient times this was taken as very, very kind of symbolic. That it was as if the foreigners were capitulating before the Messiah. They were giving up their former loyalties and saying, you are the true king. You are the one. And then, when they actually leave Herod and they continue on their journey, I haven't a clue what they saw then that would somehow lead them again until they got to Bethlehem. They'd obviously been directed to Bethlehem. And so somehow something that they saw encouraged them that they're on the right track. It said until it stopped over the place where the child was. I don't know if it means the town of Bethlehem or I don't know what that means. But the fact was they found the house. Notice they're living in a house. And then they do their homage. They effectively transfer their allegiance away from whatever they had before to this child, this little child. I wonder what they must have thought, because they went to King Herod's palace expecting to find the child there. So they're obviously prepared in some way for a royal house with these royal gifts. And when they actually arrive, they're in this average little house with this average little family. I wonder if they felt a bit incongruous, dressed up with all their finery, with all their servants and their entourage, thinking, here you are, child. You know, what kind of place is this? But nevertheless, they did it. They actually paid him homage. They, if you like, acknowledged his lordship, his mastery, his preeminence. And thinking about the gifts, the gold, the frankincense and the myrrh. Remember the hymn, We Three Kings, they translate those. Gold I bring to crown him again, frankincense brings a deity nigh, and myrrh in a stone-cold tomb. And that's not a bad way of understanding it, actually. And as I was kind of thinking about this, I was thinking myrrh, being associated with Christ's death, must be also associated with his humanity, you know, his living body. Somehow it's a recognition of his humanity, and therefore his ability to die. Somehow it says that he is the new Adam, the one who will die, but also the one who will rise again. The frankincense could represent Christ's priestly role. In the letter to the Hebrews, it said you're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Because the priest, once a year, would offer the incense on the altar. Each priest, that is, it was offered regularly. But Jesus is our great high priest. And therefore he is the one who prays and intercedes on our behalf. And I think frankincense is the act of worship and prayer. Not actually the sacrifice. Because the sacrifice is more like the myrrh. Jesus brought the sacrifice of his body, his humanity. The frankincense, therefore, would stand for his intercessions and his intermediary role as our great high priest. And gold, I bring to crown him again, as it says in the thing. The gold, the prerogative of kings, their wealth, their splendour, their power. I think one thing also that's sometimes forgotten is that the role of kings in the past was that they were the givers of gifts. If you read Beowulf, you know, the great kings are extolled for the gifts they give to people. And it's common in ancient literature to see this idea that the king is the giver of gifts. I've just been reading about the Merovingian kings and how they had great ability to raise wealth, but because it was so deeply expected that they would give gifts, they'd then give it all away again. So they're perpetually short of money because they're always having to give out this largesse, these gifts, to win the loyalty and the respect and the honour of their followers. Whereas private citizens could raise money in the same way, but they weren't obliged to give gifts, so they could just sit on it. They could just keep it. And so somehow maybe this represents Jesus as the king, not just to crown him, but also symbolic that the king is the giver of gifts. And that's a motif that does appear in Scripture, isn't it? That he rose on high, bringing gifts to men and all this kind of thing. And so I think maybe the gold, the frankincense, no, they're worth thinking about. Worth thinking about the gold for the king, the giver of gifts, the frankincense, the priest who prays and intercedes, the sweet smell of, if you like, goodness and holiness, and the myrrh, which is his body, his humanity, his death, but then also his resurrection. And the myrrh apparently has a pain-killing effect. Sometimes people put it in toothpaste to take away the sore gums and things. So maybe myrrh also represents the taking away of our pain, the alleviation of our pain, of our suffering. But all these things, they're not really stated as such, so they're things we can, if you like, meditate about. But over all these things, the overwhelming principle is that Jesus is the King for the whole world. Paul talking about this mystery, and that echoes the idea of darkness, the thing unknown, unseen. But as Paul says, this mystery of Christ is revealed, the light shines out. But it says it's a mystery that's known by the Spirit, that the Lord will speak to our hearts and our souls and our minds by his Spirit to reveal this mystery to us, that this light will shine in us, that this light will make sense to us and show us our way, and that this light this dawn, to unveil the darkness over all the peoples, the dawn of the Christ, the rising of his light, the glory of his people, Israel, to shine out over the whole world, that now all the world will recognise Israel as the place where the king came from. That now Judah is forever known, its reputation assured forever, as long as human history endures, because this is where the king came from. This is his home. This is his family, his people. And so that is how the Israelites arise and shine, for their light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon them. And the psalm simply describes the good king. Dear shall their blood be in his sight. In other words, the king that sincerely and ably cares for every single one of his people, who doesn't despise any of them, who has compassion on all of them. And the whole psalm extols that may this king be over all the earth forever, because this is the good king, and therefore worthy of our praise and thanksgiving, worthy of our gifts. And so let's pray that that light which has shone to them, that we too might do him homage, that we too might know this mystery, as Paul describes it, that this light will shine in us, that he'll be our king, and therefore care for us.